I'm Morgan Hayes, 42 years old, and I spent 20 years building a career that nobody in my family knew existed. I gave them vague answers and changed the subject and let my father introduce me at parties as Navy support work, nothing too exciting, because the alternative was explaining something I was never authorized to explain. For 2 decades, I carried the full weight of who I actually was without a single person at the dinner table having any idea. And then one morning, a rear admiral in a secure briefing room asked me, as a joke, whether support officers even get call signs these days. Have you ever done the most important work of your life in complete silence, while the people you love described you as something smaller? Tell me in the comments, because you are not alone. Before I get into what happened that morning, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to decide between being understood and being honest about who you really are, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about what it actually costs to hold your ground. What I said in that room and what it did to my father might surprise you. My father is not a bad man. That is the first thing I need you to understand, because the rest of this is going to sound like an indictment, and it isn't. He is a man who built a clear picture of the world early in his life and spent the next 50 years defending it from complication. The picture had a place for him. It had a place for my brother. It had a place for my mother and for the neighbors and for the men he served with and for the men he contracted with after he retired. It had a place for me, too. A small, tidy place in the corner, labeled Daughter, Navy Desk Work, nothing too exciting. The picture was wrong. It was wrong for 20 years. And I let it be wrong because explaining the truth would have required clearances he didn't have, and a patience I stopped trusting myself to sustain. That is how it works when your life is classified. You either fight the small lies people tell about you, or you let them go and carry the truth in your own chest, where it belongs. I let them go for a long time. And then, one November morning in a secure conference room in Northern Virginia, a rear admiral named James Croft made a joke about call signs, and the picture my father had been living inside for 20 years dissolved in about 4 seconds flat. I was born in the spring of 1984 at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, the first child of Robert Hayes, then a Marine captain, and Catherine Hayes, who had been following him from base to base since they married in 1980. My father was a serious, precise man, not cold, exactly, but economical with warmth, the way men of his generation and his branch tend to be. He loved us the way he did everything, efficiently and without excess. He expressed it through provision and structure, clean houses, full refrigerators, discipline that had a clear logic to it. He knew how to be present in a room. He just had very specific ideas about whose presence mattered in that room with him. Mine was never quite the kind he had been waiting for. My brother Daniel was born 2 years after me, and from the time Daniel could walk, he was being shaped, deliberately and with great care, into the image my father had always carried of what his children were supposed to become: a Marine, a man who did things in the field rather than behind a desk. A continuation of the Hayes family line of service, which my father traced back through 2 generations of men who had fought, bled, and earned something that could be named. I watched this from a very young age and did not understand it. And then I got older and understood it perfectly. And then I stopped trying to change it and started trying to live around it instead. We moved every 2 years the way military families do. Camp Lejeune to Camp Pendleton to 29, Palms to Quantico. My mother was good at transitions, patient, practical, the kind of woman who could dismantle a house in 48 hours and have the next one reassembled before my father finished his first week at the new command. She treated the moving as a feature rather than a burden. New schools meant new libraries, and I made immediate and serious use of every library I encountered. I read everything: history, science, maps, strategy. When I was 12 and we were living near Quantico, I checked out every book on U.S. military intelligence the library carried and read them in order over a single summer. My father, if he noticed, said nothing about it. I think he assumed it was a phase. I was 7 years old at a battalion review at Camp Lejeune, a warm Tuesday afternoon in the late summer, the kind where the humidity sits on your shoulders like a physical weight. I was in the bleachers with my mother and Daniel, who was 5 and already struggling to sit still. My father was down on the parade ground in his dress blues, moving with the precision that the Corps required and that he had internalized so completely it no longer looked like effort. I remember watching him and feeling something click into place, a certainty, clean and complete, that I wanted to do exactly what he was doing. Not the rank or the recognition, the structure of it, the precision, the sense that every person on that field had a specific purpose and knew what it was, and that the whole arrangement worked because every individual held their position. I leaned over to my mother and told her I was going to be a Marine. She smiled and straightened my hair ribbon without comment. I told my father that evening at dinner. He laughed. Not cruelly, just lightly, the way you laugh at a child who says something sweet that isn't going to happen. "That's sweet, Moggy," he said, and tousled my hair, and that was the end of it. I didn't know at 7 what to do with the fact that the thing I had just offered him, my entire future, presented openly and without reservation, had been received as charming and then set aside. I know now what to do with it, but at 7 I just went quiet and ate my dinner. The years between childhood and high school were the years in which the shape of our family became fixed, settled into patterns that would hold for decades. Robert Hayes moved up steadily, major, lieutenant colonel, then colonel, commanding a regiment at Quantico, and we moved with each new post, which meant I spent my childhood watching the inside of 3 different school systems and learning how to be the new girl in a room. I was good at it. I was good at reading a new environment quickly, at finding the hierarchy of a social system and locating myself within it in the first few days. That skill, the ability to walk into an unfamiliar room and understand it within minutes, would become the foundation of my professional life. I learned it as a child, not from training, but from necessity. I was also good at school, consistently and in every subject, in a way that my father noticed without commenting on, because Daniel's academic performance was not the point, and therefore mine was not really the point either. Daniel's path was already written in my father's imagination. He was going to be a Marine, and the Marine Corps does not require academic excellence. It requires the willingness to put yourself in the worst situation imaginable and stay there until the job is done. I wanted something too, but my wanting didn't fit the map my father was drawing, so it happened quietly, in library stacks and late evenings, in the careful, private practice of things I was interested in, but could not easily explain to my family. In the spring of 2001, my junior year of high school, I received a congressional appointment to the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. I came home on a Wednesday afternoon and placed the letter on the kitchen table without ceremony. My father read it standing, with his coffee still in his hand. He set it down, looked at me, and asked in a measured tone why I hadn't applied to Annapolis with the intention of pursuing the Marine Corps option. I told him I was interested in intelligence work, and the Navy provided the strongest officer pathway for that direction. He said, "The Navy, Morgan. You couldn't pick the branch your family comes from?" I told him the Naval Academy was his academy. Annapolis was Annapolis. He nodded, but the nod was not agreement. It was acknowledgement that the conversation had concluded. My mother gave me a look across the table that I read correctly. "This is his reaction. Let it pass. The appointment is yours, and nothing he says changes that." I let it pass. I accepted the appointment. In the fall of 2002, I reported to Annapolis and began the first chapter of a career that would take 20 years to fully come into the light. The Naval Academy was the first place I had ever lived where nobody cared about my father. That sounds simple. It was transformative. I had spent 18 years being measured, sometimes openly, sometimes not, against a standard I had not set and could not meet, the standard of being Robert Hayes's child, in the specific way Robert Hayes wanted his children to be. Nobody at Annapolis had any interest in that. Nobody knew his name. Nobody had preconceptions about what the daughter of a retired Marine colonel was supposed to become. I was a plebe with an aptitude for analytical work, a stubborn streak, and a tolerance for sleep deprivation that served me well in the first year. I could build my reputation on my own terms. I chose to build it carefully and completely. 4 years later, I was commissioned as an ensign in the spring of 2006 with a designation in naval intelligence. My father attended the commissioning ceremony in his retired dress blues. He shook my hand at the conclusion of the ceremony, the correct, formal handshake, the kind he extended to contracting colleagues at professional events. Before I had changed out of my dress whites, he was in the parking lot on his phone, talking to Daniel's Marine Corps recruiter about my brother's enlistment timeline. My mother stood beside me on the steps and didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. We both understood the message being delivered, and we had both been receiving versions of it for a long time. I spent the first 3 years of my commissioned career in standard naval intelligence postings, Norfolk, then San Diego, then a brief rotation through a joint command facility in Stuttgart. I was good at the work, not in the way that generates early recognition, but in the way that gets noticed internally by the people who are actually paying attention. The kind of officer who finds what matters in a briefing stack and synthesizes it without being directed. In 2009, at 25, I was promoted to lieutenant and assigned to a Naval Special Warfare Support Cell in Coronado, California. That assignment was the beginning of what my career would actually become. It was also the beginning of what I could no longer describe to my family. The work in Coronado was classified at a level that made casual conversation effectively impossible. I could tell my parents I was in California. I could tell them I was attached to a Navy support cell. That was the full extent of it. My father, when I called with the reassignment information, said, "California. Good weather, at least." He did not ask what the work entailed. I told myself it was fine. I was wrong about that for a long time before I finally acknowledged it. The years between 2009 and 2016 were the years in which I built a professional life that existed in a category without a public name. I advanced steadily. Lieutenant Commander in 2013, following a 6-month deployment to a location I could not name, doing work I could not describe to anyone outside the circle of people who already knew. I came home from that deployment to a Christmas dinner at my parents' house in Northern Virginia. My father, over the turkey, asked whether I had been on a ship. I said I could not get into specifics. He nodded once and turned to Daniel, who had recently made sergeant, and spent the next 20 minutes asking him about his last field exercise. He did not return to me for the rest of the evening. I sat with my coffee and watched the family I'd grown up in move through its familiar choreography, who received the attention, who generated the follow-up questions, which person's news organized the evening. And I thought about the 6 months I had just returned from, the operational rhythm of it, the colleagues who trusted each other completely and without reserve. The gap between those two worlds was measurable in a way I had never fully allowed myself to feel before. I felt it that evening, and then I let it go, the way I had been letting things go for 30 years. That was the skill I had built most thoroughly, without planning to. The skill of feeling something clearly and then releasing it cleanly and moving forward. I believed at the time that this was a virtue. I understand now that it was accommodation, and that accommodation practiced long enough has a cost that compounds. In 2016, I was promoted to commander and assumed operational leadership of a classified intelligence cell under Naval Special Warfare Command. The cell operated under the designation Task Force Wraith. I was its lead. The work demanded everything I could give it, and then some, and that suited me entirely. I had been working toward exactly this level of responsibility since my 3rd year in Coronado, and arriving at it felt like finally running at the speed I had been built for. That same year, Daniel was promoted to major at a ceremony at Marine Corps, Base Quantico. I rearranged 2 operational planning sessions to be there. I stood near the back of the reception room in civilian clothes and watched my father give a toast. He described Daniel's career with the precision and enthusiasm of a man who had been following every development for 30 years. Then he mentioned his daughter. "My Morgan," he said, "who keeps the Navy running from the support side of the house." And the assembled guests nodded politely and moved on. My brother caught my eye from across the room. He gave me the small, careful nod that meant he understood exactly what had just happened and was sorry about it in the way you are sorry about things that have been true for too long to fix with a single look. I nodded back. I left before the cake was cut. I had an operations review scheduled for 2 a.m. 3 years later, in 2019, I led the most consequential joint operation of my career. I will not tell you what it was called. I will not describe its scope or its target or its theater. I will tell you that it lasted 11 days, that it required coordination across 3 branches of the special operations community at a tempo I had never previously sustained, that it required intelligence analysis in real time, under pressure, with consequences I was fully and continuously aware of, and that when it concluded and the communications went quiet in the way communications go quiet when the hard work is done and the objective has been achieved, I sat alone in a forward operations cell for a few minutes and let myself know that we had done something that mattered. My call sign, Wraith 1, came out of that operation in the way call signs always come. Not chosen, but given by the people who watched you work and decided the name fit the officer. I was promoted to captain that same year. 13 years in the Navy, 35 years old. That autumn, at a neighbor's retirement party at my parents' house in Northern Virginia, my father introduced me to a room full of retired military and civilian guests as my daughter. She does Navy support coordination. I smiled. I drove home in the dark with the call sign patch in my jacket pocket, zipped into the interior lining where it traveled with me everywhere. I said nothing for the entire 40-minute drive. Not from anger. From the practiced calm of a woman who had been doing this mathematics for a very long time and had learned to accept the numbers without letting them define what she knew about herself. In 2022, I was promoted to Rear Admiral, lower half. I was 38 years old. At that time, I was the youngest female flag officer in Naval Special Warfare Command history. There was no press release. There was no ceremony visible to anyone outside the community. I sent my mother a brief text. She called me back within 3 minutes and said, "Oh, Morgan," in a voice that contained 20 years of everything she had been caring for me and about me, compressed into 2 words. I had to sit down after that phone call. My father texted 3 days later. He had heard from Catherine and offered congratulations and asked whether I would be coming home for Thanksgiving. I came home for Thanksgiving. At the dinner table, he introduced me to a contractor colleague sitting beside him as my daughter in the Navy. I ate the turkey. I helped with the dishes. I drove home before dessert was served. On the morning of November 14th, 2025, I arrived at a classified Joint Special Operations Planning Conference at a secure DoD facility in Northern Virginia 40 minutes before the scheduled start time. I arrived early because I always arrived early, not from anxiety, but because arriving early was how I operated. The room needed to be set before the principals entered. My aide, Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair, was already positioned at the side table with the briefing materials organized and ready. I reviewed the agenda, signed off on 2 last-minute amendments to the briefing order, and stood at the window for a few minutes with my first coffee of the morning, looking at the facility's unremarkable parking lot and running through the day's priorities. I was in civilian clothes as my assignment required, dark blazer, no insignia, a lanyard badge that identified me by clearance level, and a numeric designation rather than name or rank. That was the standard configuration for my kind of meeting. It was how I had arrived at meetings like this for 9 years. Nobody looking at me from the outer seats would have known what they were looking at unless they already knew. That was precisely the point. At 8:50, the contractor advisory group was admitted to the outer ring of observer seating around the conference table. My father walked in with them, wearing a gray business suit and a contractor badge on a blue lanyard, the standard attire for the advisory role his firm held. He entered the room the way he had entered every professional room in his life, with a practiced, unhurried scan, orienting himself to the hierarchy and the layout simultaneously. I watched him do it from the head of the table, and I saw the exact moment he found me in the room. He stopped walking for precisely 1 full second. I counted. Then he resumed and made his way to the outer seating row, found the chair beside a retired Army colonel he recognized from previous engagements, and settled in. He leaned toward the colonel, not quietly enough. "That's my daughter," he said. "Navy support work, nothing too exciting." The colonel gave a brief, polite nod and returned to his materials. The room continued to fill around them. I returned my attention to the briefing documents in front of me. I had made that specific internal motion, the quiet pivot away from the sentence, the release of it, more times than I had counted. Once more was not going to be the one that broke something. At 900 hours, Rear Admiral James Croft entered the room precisely on time. Croft was a career Naval Special Warfare officer. Compact, silver-haired, in his mid-50s, with the unhurried authority of someone who had operated in every major theater, and stopped feeling the need to announce himself a decade ago. He had an easy manner in rooms, the product of genuine competence held lightly. He took his seat, opened the meeting with a brief efficiency check, and ran through introductions around the table at a businesslike pace. He moved through the principals, then the senior observers, then reached the contractor section. He nodded to the faces he recognized. His eyes moved to me, in civilian clothes, coffee in hand, at the head of the table, and then briefly to the outer ring where my father sat, and then back to me. He made the connection easily. He had heard what my father said. He decided to warm the room with it, the way senior officers sometimes do at the opening of a long and serious meeting, a small, easy joke to settle the temperature before the heavy work starts. "Your father tells me you handle Navy support coordination," he said. There was nothing unkind in it. He was a good man, making a reasonable assumption based on information he had just received, framing it lightly. "Do support officers get call signs these days?" Several people at the table laughed. It was comfortable laughter, polite, brief, the laughter of people who appreciated the levity. My father, in the outer ring, adjusted his position slightly in his chair. I set down my coffee cup. One deliberate motion. The laughter was still moving through the room when I looked at Croft directly. Wraith 1. 2 words, and then silence. Not the silence of awkwardness, a different kind of silence, the kind that has a texture and a specific weight. Croft's easy expression disappeared. Not in embarrassment, not in confusion, but in the specific way a face changes when a room you thought you understood has just reorganized itself around information you didn't have. He recognized the call sign the way you recognize a name you have heard spoken in operational debriefs for 6 consecutive years, in rooms where only certain people are authorized to be in the room when the name is said. He rose from his chair, slowly, without theatrics, without ceremony, simply standing, because standing was what the moment required. And every flag officer and senior operator at that table rose with him, not because protocol demanded it, but because they knew what that call sign meant, and the standing was the only honest response they had. "Admiral Hayes." His voice was measured and clear. "I apologize. I was not aware you would be attending in a civilian configuration today." "No apology necessary, James," I said. "Let's get started." I did not look toward the outer ring. I did not need to. Priya had already crossed quietly to the contractor seating and placed a single sheet of paper in front of my father. A declassified, redacted 1-page framework summary of Operation Wraith's outcome. Approved for contractor-level distribution. I heard the faint sound of paper being lifted and turned, and then I heard nothing from that direction for the next 2 hours. Robert Hayes, who had been in rooms with generals his entire professional life, who had shaken the hands of 4-star officers and sat in the same room with commandants and service chiefs, was reading about his daughter for the first time. The briefing ran until 1100 hours. I spent 20 minutes afterward in the exit corridor with Croft and 2 Army colonels discussing follow-on coordination timelines and the calendar for the next planning cycle. The professional conversation was easy and precise, the language of people who work in the same specific register. I was aware, at the edge of my peripheral attention, of my father in the corridor behind us, moving slowly without destination, waiting. He had not waited for me at a professional event in my career. I filed it without breaking from the conversation. When the debrief concluded, I found him in the parking structure, seated on a concrete barrier wall beside his rental car, the 1-page summary still in his hands. He had been there long enough for the paper to develop a slight crease from where his hands had gripped it. He looked up when he heard my footsteps and did not reach for a prepared expression. "How long?" he said. I told him. 20 years. He looked at the pavement. He began to apologize and made 3 separate attempts at it, and I let him reach the middle of the 3rd before I stopped him. "I know you didn't know," I said. "You didn't know because I didn't tell you, but you also didn't ask. For 20 years, you stood beside me in professional rooms and introduced me as support staff, as desk work, as nothing too exciting. Every single time you did it, you were choosing that story over who I actually was. I need you to sit with that before you try to explain it away." He did not argue. He looked at the pavement for a long time. Then he looked at me. He didn't say anything. It was, I realized, the most honest response I had received from him in years. Not an explanation, not a redirection, just a man with something heavy sitting in his chest and no trained response to reach for. I told him to call me when he was ready. I walked back to my car and drove north. In the week that followed, I made a decision without ceremony or announcement. I had been arriving in rooms as the person my father had decided I was for 20 years. I was done. His first voicemail was 31 seconds about the weather. His second was nearly a minute of halting pauses followed by, "I looked up Wraith 1. There's nothing public. I know that's the point. I wanted you to know I looked. I called Daniel at 5:30 in the morning from my kitchen. He told me our father had never once asked him, in 6 years, what I actually did, because he had assumed I wanted it kept quiet. I told him I had wanted it that way for a long time. I didn't anymore. Thanksgiving came and went without me. I sent my regrets by text and spent the holiday with 4 members of my staff at a folding table with grocery store pie and easy laughter about nothing that required a security clearance. I glanced at my phone once during dinner, saw my father's missed call, and put it face down on the table. My brother called that evening. He said our father had phoned him 3 times that day, lost, asking what to do next. Daniel told him to wait and to keep thinking about 20 years of Navy support work while he waited. Our father apparently did exactly that. The weeks that followed were the weeks in which Robert Hayes began, for the first time in decades, to try to find out who his daughter was. At a defense contractors meeting in December, a retired Navy captain mentioned Task Force Wraith in the context of a joint planning framework. My father said quietly that his daughter might have been involved with that task force. The captain set down his coffee cup. He stared at my father for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in the specific lowered voice of someone sharing information that outranks the setting, that Operation Wraith had prevented strategic outcomes that would have altered the balance of the Western Pacific in ways nobody wanted to contemplate. That if the coordination had failed, if the intelligence had been late or wrong or incomplete, the losses would have been catastrophic and irreversible. My father drove home that evening and did not turn on the radio for the entire drive. He sat at the kitchen table and told my mother everything he had learned. She told him, with a patience assembled over 30 years of quietly carrying things, that she had known it was serious for a long time, that Morgan had once called from a satellite phone in the middle of the night, that her voice had sounded like someone operating somewhere that mattered, somewhere permanent and consequential, and that she had known better than to ask for details. My father sat at that table for a long time after she finished speaking. He wrote me a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, which my father had not done since correspondence was an official requirement of his rank. He sent it to Daniel, who scanned it and forwarded it. The letter held up a memory. Morgan, at 8 years old, lying on her back in the summer grass in the backyard, pointing at the sky and naming every constellation she had memorized from a library book, one after another until she had gone through all of them. He wrote that he should have paid more attention to the girl who memorized the stars. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not try to explain. He just held the memory up and let it say what it could on its own. I read the letter twice at 5:30 in the morning at my kitchen table. Then I put it in the desk drawer. Not because it didn't matter, because I needed to be still with it for a while before I decided what to do about it. In February of 2026, I agreed to meet my father for coffee at a shop near my office in Arlington. I arrived 2 minutes early. He was already there, corner table, back to the wall, coffee ordered, his hands wrapped around the cup. I registered without remarking on it that he had arrived before me. We sat across from each other, without the management of a holiday gathering, without family members to soften the edges, without the performance of normalcy that structured most of our time together. He did not lead with an explanation. He told me directly that when my career became classified and I could no longer describe it, he had filled that gap with a story that let him remain comfortable, that let him feel like he understood something he did not understand. He told me the story was a lie he had built for himself and maintained, and that the maintenance of it had required diminishing me every time someone asked. He said he was telling me it was wrong, not asking me to understand it or forgive it on any particular timeline. I told him what I needed. Not for him to understand the classified work, he could never access it, and I could not describe it. I needed him to stop explaining me to people as though he understood something about me he did not. I needed him to ask questions, not operational questions, not classified questions, but the ordinary questions a father asks about a daughter's life when he is genuinely interested in the answer. He is easier to talk to, he said, meaning Daniel. I know that, I said. I have known it since I was 8 years old. I am asking you to try with me anyway. He said he could do that. I told him that was enough for now. We finished our coffees and he paid, and we walked out into the gray February cold. On the sidewalk before we went to our separate cars, he told me he was proud of me and that he should have said it 20 years ago and that he was saying it now. I looked at him for a moment. I told him I knew. I told him that was enough. He gave the nod, the Marine Colonel nod, the one he produces when the words have run out and the situation calls for something measured, and walked to his car. I watched him go. Something had shifted in the room between us. Not healed, I was not using that word yet. But something had moved, and I was willing to let the movement be what it was. In March of 2026, I received my new command assignment. I read the encrypted orders at my desk at 5:40 in the morning, set the tablet down, and poured a second coffee while I looked at the familiar view outside my office window. The assignment was the culmination of everything I had been building since Coronado, a command that would never have a press release, that would never appear in any public announcement, that would matter in ways I would never be able to describe to anyone outside the secured facilities where those descriptions lived. I sent my father a brief, factual text. No details, just the news. He replied in 20 seconds. I know what this means. I don't know the specifics, but I know what it means. I'm proud of you, Morgan. No reservations this time. I stood in my kitchen in the early dark and read that text for a full minute. I did not need it to make the assignment real. The assignment was real on its own terms, earned in rooms he would never enter. But I was glad he said it. I let that gladness be straightforward and clean, without qualification. On a July morning in 2026, I stood at Naval Station Norfolk in dress whites for my change of command ceremony. The hall was formal and precise, a Navy band, flag officers arranged on the stage, the full institutional weight of the organization I had given my working life to gathered in one place. When the command came and the room came to attention, I walked in and felt the weight of the moment differently than I had expected. I have stood at attention for generals my entire career. I have been in rooms where the rising was obligatory, required by protocol, and rooms where it was earned by the person entering. And I have learned over time to tell the precise difference between those two things. When that room stood for me, that July morning, it was earned. Every person in it understood why. I felt it the way I feel most significant things, quietly, without performance, but completely. My father was in the front row between my mother and Daniel. He stood when the room came to attention. He did not look surprised. He did not look proud. In the open, declarative way he had always looked proud at Daniel's ceremonies. The chin lift, the scan of the room to check whether others were registering it. The fatherhood as social performance that I had watched him produce at every promotion and award for my brother since Daniel was 20. He looked quiet. He looked certain. He looked like a man who had done the private, difficult work of understanding something he had been wrong about for a long time, and who was present in the way people are present when they have actually arrived somewhere rather than simply appearing. He knew exactly whose ceremony this was and why the room was standing. That was what I had needed from him for 40 years. That was everything. At the reception afterward, he found me in the crowd. He extended his hand, the formal grip he had given me at every military ceremony since Annapolis, since the day he had shaken my hand and gone to the parking lot to call Daniel's recruiter. And then, before I could respond, he stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. He is not a man who hugs. He is 72 years old, and he still stands at parade rest when he does not know what to do with his body. The hug was brief, careful, and completely sincere. 4 seconds, his hand flat on my back. A man who was not practiced at physical warmth, doing the most precise and honest version of it. He knew how to offer. He did not say anything, neither did I. 4 seconds, and then he released me and stepped back. That was it. That was the whole thing, and it was enough. It was, if I am honest with myself, more than I had believed I would ever receive from him, and I allowed that understanding to land without minimizing it or explaining it away. I drove home that evening alone, windows cracked, the July air moving through the car in the way it does on the coast when the evening is cooling down from the day's heat. I thought about the 7-year-old in the bleachers at Camp Lejeune who watched her father march across the parade ground and felt something click into place. The certainty that she was going to do something that mattered, that she was going to find the thing that was built for her and build herself to fit it. She was right. She had no way of knowing how long the road would be, or how much of it she would travel in the dark without recognition, or how many times she would stand at the edge of a room and be described by someone who had no idea who she was. But she was right about the fundamental thing, that the work was worth it, that doing it carefully and completely and in service of something larger than the approval of any single person in her life was worth all of it. The missing holidays and the classified moves and the voicemails left unreturned and the dinners where she was described as support staff while the turkey went cold. It was worth it on its own terms, for its own reasons, not because of where it eventually led, but because of what it was while she was doing it. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine and sat in the dark for a moment, in the familiar quiet that I have always needed to close the day properly. The ceremony was behind me. The new command was ahead of me. My father had given me 4 seconds, which was the most he had, and I had taken all of it. I let myself feel the wholeness of it, the piece of a career that had finally, completely surfaced into visibility, even just the small portion of it that could. And I sat with it until it settled into the place where it belonged, and then I went inside. If you have ever spent years carrying a version of yourself that someone else invented, if you have ever done work that mattered while the people closest to you described you as something smaller and more manageable and easier to explain, I want you to know something. The room always finds out eventually. You do not have to announce it. You do not have to fight for it. You just have to keep doing the work in the dark and trust that the truth will find the light on its own schedule, in its own time, in the exact room where it belongs. The only person you truly need to answer to, at the end of all of it, is the version of yourself who decided a very long time ago that this was worth doing. I answered to her every single day for 20 years. I still do. I always will. There's something I want to go back and explain about those years, the years between Coronado and the briefing room, because I think it matters to understand them correctly. It was not simply that I kept my career classified from my family, and my father filled the silence with a wrong assumption. It was that I made an active and sustained choice to let him. There were moments when I could have corrected the record, not with classified details, but with the simple force of insisting that he stop describing me the way he did. I could have pulled him aside at Daniel's promotion and said, "Stop telling people I handle support work. You don't know what I handle." I could have said it at any of the parties, any of the dinners, any of the family gatherings where the sentence came out of his mouth with such practiced ease that it no longer even registered as a choice. I let it go every time. And the reason I let it go, the honest reason, was not entirely about protecting classified information. It was also that I had concluded, somewhere in my late 20s, that getting my father to see me accurately would require a sustained campaign of effort I did not have the reserve for, and that the energy was better spent on the work itself. I told myself that was pragmatism. I told myself that the work was what mattered, and the recognition would come from the community that actually understood it, and that was enough. I believed that, mostly. But I was also avoiding something. I was avoiding the full weight of his disappointment in who I had turned out to be, which I had been managing since I was 7 years old and found it easier, most of the time, to simply not show him anything he could diminish. The cost of that, I understand now, was not only mine. My father spent 20 years without access to the truth of his own daughter. He built a relationship with a version of me that did not exist and defended it with introductions at parties and toasts at receptions, and in doing so, he kept himself from knowing something that would have changed the shape of his understanding of his family, of his legacy, of what the name Hayes meant in a room. I am not saying this to take responsibility for his choices. He made his, and I made mine, and the accounting of that is separate from the accounting of this. I am saying it because when I sat in that parking structure with him after the briefing, what I saw on his face was not just embarrassment and not just the shock of a man who has been corrected. It was grief. Specific and private grief, the kind that comes from realizing you have been wrong about something in a way that cannot be undone, only lived forward from. I recognized it. I have been carrying my own version of it for a long time, and it looks the same in every face it crosses. What I did not do, in the parking structure or in any conversation that followed, was tell my father that it was all right. Because it was not all right, and telling him otherwise would have been a kindness that neither of us deserved nor needed. Some things are not all right. They happened the way they happened, and the only honest response to them is to acknowledge that plainly and decide what comes next. What came next for me was the choice to stop managing his perception and start living in the full version of my life, which meant practically the same career I had always had, in the same rooms I had always occupied, doing the same work. The only difference was internal. I stopped shrinking when I entered the family rooms. I stopped letting the dinner table be a place where I became someone smaller than who I was in every other room I entered. That is a quiet change. It does not produce dramatic scenes or shouting matches. It is simply the decision, taken once and then held, to be entirely yourself in every room you are in, regardless of who is watching and what they have decided to see. The letter my father wrote, the one about the girl who memorized the stars, I kept in the desk drawer for 3 weeks before I read it a third time. When I did, I noticed something I had missed in the first 2 readings. He did not write about what I had accomplished. He wrote about what he had failed to witness while it was happening. He described the 8-year-old in the backyard not as a memory of a child being impressive, but as a memory of himself sitting inside the house while she was out there, having decided without conscious intent that what she was doing did not need his attention. He was writing about the cost of not paying attention. He understood, by the time he wrote that letter, that not paying attention had been a choice, and that choices have consequences, and that 20 years of a particular choice had produced a particular consequence. A daughter who had built an extraordinary life without a single brick of his acknowledgement in it. He was not asking me to thank him for the letter. He was not asking me to come home for Christmas, or explain what I did, or make anything easier for him. He was just holding up the 8-year-old and admitting that he had looked away from her and that looking away had been a mistake. That was what I needed to hear. Not the accomplishments, not the pride, but the admission of the looking away. My mother knew more than she ever said, and that is a separate story. But the small piece of it that belongs here is this. She called me after the February coffee meeting with my father and asked how it had gone. I told her it had gone as well as it could, which was true. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said that she had been watching my father try to find his way back to me for the 3 months since November, and that it was slow, and that he was doing it in the way he did everything, methodically, without enough information, at his own pace, but that he was doing it. She said she thought he understood something now that he had not understood before. I asked her what. She said, what it costs someone to carry the truth of themselves for 20 years without anyone asking to see it. I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. She was right. That is exactly what it costs. And the fact that she had seen it clearly and held it for all those years, waiting for him to find his own way to the same understanding, told me everything about the woman I had learned my patience from. The change of command ceremony was not the end of anything, and I want to be careful not to frame it that way. My relationship with my father is not repaired in the way that broken things are repaired, where you mend the crack and it holds, and eventually you stop seeing where it was. It is more like a building that has been under renovation for a very long time and has finally had its scaffolding removed. The structure is sound, the work shows, if you know where to look. But it is standing, and it is his and mine. And we are both inside it now in a way we were not before. He calls more than he used to. He asks questions, not operational questions, not classified questions, just the questions of a man learning to be curious about someone he should have been curious about for 40 years. He asks what the work is like in the way people ask when they genuinely want to understand the texture of something rather than its title. I answer in the terms I am able to answer in, and he listens in the way people listen when they have finally decided to actually hear what the other person is saying. It is not effortless. It is not the relationship we would have had if he had been paying attention from the beginning. But it is real. And real at this point in my life is what I am most interested in. I told you at the beginning that my father is not a bad man. I want to close by telling you what he is. He is a man who carried the image of what family was supposed to look like for so long and so completely that he stopped being able to see the family he actually had. That is a particular kind of limitation. It is not cruelty, and it is not indifference. It is the absence of curiosity, the failure to ask. And the cost of not asking is that you spend years in confident possession of a story that is wrong, and then one day in a conference room with security clearances posted on the door, a rear admiral you've known for 15 years stands up when your daughter says 2 words, and the story dissolves, and you are left with the pavement in a parking structure and a 1-page summary of a career you had no idea existed. The cost of not asking is 20 years. The cost of starting to ask, even late, is much less. He started asking. That is what I am left with. That, and the 4 seconds in the July heat outside a reception hall, and the pavement under my feet as I walked back through the door, knowing finally and completely that the room that had always mattered most already knew who I was. The Navy has a saying, one of those sayings that circulates in the community and doesn't make it into official publications because it is too true to be institutional, that the best operators are the ones nobody's looking for, because the ones nobody is looking for are doing the real work. I have thought about that saying often over the course of my career. I thought about it in Coronado when I was first learning what classified work actually required of a person. Not just the discretion and the silence, but the willingness to let your professional life exist in a category that cannot be publicly verified, cannot be shared at dinner tables, cannot be cited on a resume in any form that would mean anything to anyone outside the specific community who knows what the citations refer to. I thought about it in the Horn of Africa on a deployment I could not name, working alongside people whose names I could not say in any room that wasn't secured, doing work whose stakes I could not explain to my family when I came home to a Christmas dinner and my father asked if I had been on a ship. I thought about it every time my father introduced me as support work or desk work or logistics, because in a specific and technical sense he was not entirely wrong. There's a version of what I do that looks, from the outside, exactly like that. The classified nature of the work is precisely the mechanism by which it cannot be corrected. You cannot defend a classified identity with classified information. You either let it stand, or you say something that you're not authorized to say. I let it stand. Every time. For 20 years, I let it stand. What I want to tell you, and what I think is the thing in this story that will stay with you, if anything does, is that the person who paid the highest price for that silence was not me. I knew who I was. I carried it with me into every room I entered, every operation I led, every decision I made at 3 a.m. in a secured facility when the stakes were actual and the consequences of being wrong were not recoverable. My identity was not in question in those rooms. The person who paid the highest price for the silence was my father, because he spent 20 years with a daughter he did not know. He built a relationship with a fiction and maintained it with introductions at parties, and the woman he was introducing in those moments was not his daughter. She was a character he had invented to fill the gap where curiosity would have been. That is the thing about not asking. It does not leave a clean absence. It fills in. The gap becomes a story, and the story becomes the relationship. And eventually the relationship is between two people who are both living inside the story rather than looking at each other. I did not have the tools or the bandwidth or, if I am being fully honest, the willingness to dismantle that story while I was in the middle of building a career that demanded everything I had. And so it stood. And then it didn't. There is a specific kind of relief that comes from being seen accurately after a long period of being seen incorrectly. It is not triumph. It does not feel the way I would have expected it to feel when I was 35 and driving home in the dark with a call sign patch in my jacket pocket. It feels quieter than that. It feels like putting something down that you had been carrying for so long you had stopped registering the weight of it. And then you set it down, and your shoulders remember what it felt like before the weight was there, and the memory of it is almost more striking than the absence. That is what the briefing room felt like. Not victory, but the setting down of something that I had been carrying in one form or another since I was 7 years old in the bleachers at Camp Lejeune, watching my father on the parade ground and already understanding, without the words for it, that I was going to have to earn something he had not decided to give me yet. I earned it. It took 20 years. And when it came in the form of a rear admiral pushing back his chair in a secure conference room in Northern Virginia, and the room rising with him, and my father in the outer ring unable to locate his next sentence. That was it. That was the whole thing. I want to say one more thing about Priya, because she deserves more than a side note in someone else's story. Lieutenant Commander Priya Nair has served as my flag aide for 5 years, and she is one of the most capable officers I have had the privilege of working alongside in my career. She is the one who placed the one-page summary in front of my father without being asked to. She read the room in the moment after Wraith 1 landed and understood, precisely and immediately, what needed to happen next and did it with no direction from me. That is what it looks like when you work alongside someone who truly understands the nature of the work. She did not make a production of it. She crossed the room, placed the paper, and returned to the wall. My father read the summary. The room went on. Everything that followed, the parking structure, the letter, the February coffee, the July ceremony, was made possible, in part, by that one quiet motion Priya made in the 60 seconds after the room stood up. I told her so, later. She said she was glad it worked. That is the kind of person she is. I have been lucky, in my career, to be surrounded by people like her, and I want that acknowledged, because the call sign is mine, and the story is mine, but the work was never mine alone. If you are someone who is doing the real work right now, in whatever field, in whatever capacity, and the people around you are describing you as something smaller, and the gap between who you are in the rooms that count and who you are in your family's understanding of you feels uncrossable, I want you to know it is not uncrossable. It is just slow. It closes at a pace you cannot always control, and in a form you cannot always predict. Sometimes it closes with a dramatic moment in a conference room and a rear admiral standing up. More often it closes with a letter written at a kitchen table, or a text sent in 20 seconds, or a 4-second hug outside a reception hall in July. All of those are real. All of them count. The room always finds out eventually. Your job is to keep doing the work until it does. I answered to that assignment every day for 20 years. I still do. The thing about a classified career that I have never found a way to explain adequately to anyone outside it is that the invisibility is structural. It is not accidental, and it is not circumstantial. It is built into the architecture of the work by design, because the work requires it, because the operations require it, because the people you are protecting require it. The invisibility is the feature, not the bug. And I chose this. I want to be clear about that. I chose this branch, this designation, this pathway, knowing what the classification structure would mean for my ability to be known by the people closest to me. I chose it because it was the right work, and because I was built for it, and because the work itself provided a kind of completeness that I had not found anywhere else. I am not a person who needs to be seen by everyone. I am a person who needs the work to matter. The work mattered. It mattered every single day, in ways I cannot fully describe even now. And that was enough. It was enough on its own terms for 20 years, and it continues to be enough. What I did not anticipate, what I think most people who make this choice do not fully anticipate, is that the invisibility compounds. It starts as a professional necessity, and over time it becomes a relational posture. You get good at not correcting the wrong assumptions. You get good at the small diplomatic pivot, the subject change, the smile that acknowledges something without engaging with it. You get so good at it that it starts to happen outside the classified context, in the rooms where you could actually say something. With the people who would actually benefit from hearing it, you have practiced the silence for so long that the silence is your first language now. I was doing it at family dinners about things that were not classified. I was doing it when my father said something dismissive about my career, and I changed the subject instead of saying, "That is not true. Let me tell you what is." I had extended the operational posture into the personal life and convinced myself it was protecting something. It was protecting the status quo. That is not the same thing. The briefing room was the end of the status quo. Not because James Croft stood up, and not because my father finally saw something true, but because I had stopped, at some point in the months leading up to that conference, actively maintaining the fiction. I had stopped making myself available for the introduction. I had stopped arriving at family gatherings with the posture of a woman who was willing to be described as support staff without response. The briefing room did not happen to me. It was the result of a long and deliberate shift that had been accumulating quietly in me for a year or more before November. Croft just accelerated the timeline. My father's presence in that room, which neither of us had planned, provided the specific audience that made the acceleration visible in a way it would not otherwise have been. But the shift was already happening. I was already done. The briefing room was the day the outside of my life caught up with the inside of it. And that is a very different thing from a dramatic reversal engineered by circumstance. I am 42 years old. I have been in the Navy for 20 years. I have commanded a classified Joint Special Operations Task Force. I have a call sign that has traveled through operational debriefs and planning sessions across 3 theaters and multiple branches and will continue to travel after I'm no longer attached to it. I have a father who stood in the front row of my change of command ceremony and held on for 4 seconds, which is the most he has ever managed, and it was enough. I have a mother who knew more than anyone gave her credit for, and carried it with the patience of a woman who understood that the truth comes out on its own schedule. I have a brother who always believed I would surpass everything our father built and kept that belief to himself for 30 years because he assumed it did not need saying. I have a team that stood in a conference room and rose when a call sign landed, and that rising was the most honest thing that room has ever contained. I have a career built entirely in the dark, and I have no regret about any of it. Not the silence, not the dinners, not the 20 years. The silence was the price of the work, and the work was worth it, and I would pay it again. That is what I want you to hold from this. Not the moment in the briefing room, though the moment in the briefing room was real, and it mattered, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. But the thing underneath it, the decision made quietly and without fanfare in a Naval Academy classroom in 2002 to do the work that I was built for, in the way that the work required, regardless of who understood it and who didn't. That decision has been the axis of my life. Every promotion, every operation, every classified posting, every Christmas dinner where I was described as desk work and said nothing, all of it connects back to that decision. I made the right decision. I made it before I had any idea what it would cost, and I would make it again with full knowledge of the cost, because that is what it means to find the thing you are supposed to do and do it without apology. Find the thing. Do it without apology. Let the room figure out the rest on its own schedule. I still do. I always will. If there is someone in your life who has been writing a smaller version of you into their story, calling your work nothing too exciting, explaining you away to people who haven't even asked, I want you to know that you don't have to fight it. You don't have to announce yourself. You just have to keep doing the thing you're built for, and let the truth catch up at its own pace. It always does. My father and I are still figuring out what the next version of our relationship looks like. It's slow and it's honest and it's real, which is more than I can say for the 20 years before it. I'll take that. If this one hit home for you, I'd really love to know your story. Drop it in the comments. Have you ever had someone in your family describe you to the world as something you weren't? How did the truth finally come out? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe and hit the bell.